Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Can you hear me okay on here? Okay. Great. So I'm Colleen Stockman. I'm Assistant Curator for Special Projects here at the Cantor Art Center, and I had the pleasure of working on our presentation of She Who Tells a Story, Women Photographers from Iran and the Arab World. So the exhibition comes to us from the MFA Boston, the Museum of Fine Arts there, and the original curator, Kristen Gresh, has traveled the world and met a lot of the photographers kind of in her travels and her studies, and just noticed this incredible trend of very strong work coming in particular from women in Iran and various countries. So she put together the exhibition, and we were thrilled to host it here at Stanford, where there has been incredible interest from the students, from the faculty, from the community. This is a great example of just how much people are catalyzing around the exhibition, around the role of women in the arts and in literature. So this is a perfect panel to really be looking at the work a bit more deeply. So there are 12 women photographers in the exhibition from about 8 different countries. And when I started to chat about this with Robert Cruz and Brookshaw, we just noticed right away this incredible connection with literature, as you can see in this work by Shireen Nishat here. So that sort of spurred the discussion that resulted in this wonderful panel. So I just want to say a few thanks, and I'll introduce Dr. Milani, our esteemed moderator today, who will then introduce our panelists, and we'll launch right in. So again, to those who just joined us, thank you for coming tonight as we discuss women, literature, and the arts in the Middle East, this incredible program that the Sohaib and Sarah Abbasi program in Islamic Studies has put together. So tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Islamic Studies program, the Hamid and Christina Moghadam program in Iranian Studies, Stanford Global Studies, the Clayman Institute for Gender Research, Stanford Humanities Center, and the Cantor. So it's really quite, it's just a great example of what these exhibitions can do to really bring together multiple disciplines and communities across campus. And the Cantor just wants to also gratefully acknowledge the support of the Klumec Foundation, and the Mark and Betsy Gates Fund for the exhibition's presentation here at Stanford. So I want to also thank Issa Lampa, who's our Associate Director for Academic Engagement, Michelle Ho, who did all the coordinating, along with Orit, who's over there, and again, Brookshaw and Robert for bringing this great program to sort of give extra meaning to the exhibition and a bit more context for the artwork. So tonight we have 3 incredible panelists here, Atiya Ahmad, Dominic Brookshaw, and Nesrin Rahimieh. And then, of course, Dr. Abbas Milani, who is here to moderate. So he is the Hamid and Christina Moghadam Director of Iranian Studies here at Stanford, a founding co-director of the Iran Democracy Project, and a research fellow at the Hoover Institute. He previously taught law and political science at Tehran University, where he was also on the board of the university's Center for International Relations. After moving to the U.S. in 1986, he was chair of the political science department at the Notre Dame de Namur University in Belmont, sorry if I said that wrong, nearby, and was then a visiting research fellow at UC Berkeley before coming to Stanford in 2002. So he's published more than 20 books, including The Shah, which is recent from 2011, I think, 200 articles and books from numerous publications. So we're thrilled to have such a wide range of expertise in our moderator tonight. Dr. Milani has translated numerous books and articles into both Persian and English, and of course his own work has been translated into numerous languages. He's won many grants, teaching awards, and fellowships, and has on numerous occasions appeared on major news and opinion programs. I just saw one actually the other day. Can't remember what station that was. Is that right? Yeah, something online. And then, of course, here in the U.S. and around the world. So again, we're thrilled to have this very diverse panelists here tonight to talk about literature and the arts in the Middle East, beautiful connections with the artwork in the exhibition. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Milani. Thank you.
Good afternoon. There are seats in the front, particularly if you want to stay. It is my great privilege to be doing a little that I need to do as a moderator, which means I keep the time, and then when we need to have you ask questions, I'll try to call on you. I know 2 of the panelists very well. They're dear friends, one of them a dear colleague who decided to go back to his home territory, Oxford. I'll say a few words about them by way of introduction, the way it will work. They will each give a presentation of about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer period. I want to especially begin by thanking two people who really have made this possible. One is Connie Wolf, whose vision, whose interest in the Middle East has truly changed the nature of the exhibitions that they have here, and promises, I think, to have many more events like this, many more exhibits about the Middle East, about Iran, about the Arab world. So I'm very grateful to be working with her. Second, I want to thank Professor Cruz and the Abbasi program for taking the lead in this event, and then for affording me a chance to be a very small part of it. The first panelist is Professor Atiya Ahmad from George Washington University. I just found out that she's a visiting fellow here at the Humanities. Professor Ahmad is an anthropologist with interest in international affairs. She has published widely on issues of gender, feminist studies, anthropology, Islam, and transnational and global issues. Dominic Brookshaw, who was here till not long ago, is now at Oxford. He is a professor now, associate professor at Oxford University. He has published again widely on the issue of women literature in Iran particularly, but he has also written about Hafiz, he's written about Ubayd, he's written about the Persian language, and some of his work on 19th century women in Iran is truly pioneering. When he first told me that he's writing about this, I was surprised that there is such a wide range of writers, and he has written first about many of them. Professor Nesrin Rahimieh is one of the more esteemed woman scholar, feminist scholars of the Middle East. She has written, again, widely till recently. She led the Center for Iranian Studies at the University of California, Irvine, and I think she was the second director and established a wonderful reputation that center has had. She has also published in numerous scholarly and opinion journals and has been a very observant critic of woman literature both in Iran and in the rest of the Middle East. So it is my privilege to be sitting at the table with them, listen and learn from them.
Okay. Can you all hear me? Is this on? Okay. So first and foremost, I wanted to thank the Abbasi program and the Cantor Arts Center for organizing this event. Can you all hear me? Yep. All right, just double checking. And also wanted to thank the Stanford Humanities Center, where I'm very happily based this year. And then lastly, I wanted to thank you all for coming. This is a marvelous exhibition. It's wonderful to be a part of it in some small form, and it's wonderful to share thoughts, ideas, both in terms of this presentation and hopefully in our Q&A. Okay, so as has been mentioned, I'm an anthropologist who works in the region in the Middle East and South Asia, the Indian Ocean, and my research focuses on gender, Islam, and political economy. So I'm underscoring all of this to point out that I'm not an artist, nor am I a scholar of the arts. So my presentation today will focus on the realms that I am most familiar with, and what I'll try to do is put these works in their historical and social context. So how many of you had a chance to look at them? Chance, okay. So it's a marvelous exhibition, right? Incredibly rich, complex, diverse, and I will start off with that all-important caveat, right? That it's impossible to summarize them, right? There's no way, there's no grand thematic that's going to encapsulate the richness, the diversity, et cetera, of the works. But I would like to suggest a framework that'll be helpful to think through important themes we see throughout many of the works. Okay? And the theme is as follows, that the works focus on the everyday, so everyday items, objects, activities, scenes, to complicate or refract dominant discourses, representations, ways of knowing about women in the Middle East. So what do I mean by dominant discourses? not only how women are depicted in popular media, popular understanding, and even in scholarly works, but how these images and stories do not just simply reflect, depict, or represent reality per se, but how they also shape, create, and are part and parcel of the production of that very reality that many assume they just merely represent, that they merely represent. Okay? So that's what I mean by dominant discourses. And then the second issue is, what are the dominant discourses that I'd like to underline? So the first is national discourses where women are associated with tradition or culture, and this is associated with their repression. So that's one of the dominant discourses that these works play with, refract. The second dominant discourse, or colonial or Orientalist discourses, that depict Middle Eastern women as radically other, and often as inferior or in a hierarchical position vis-a-vis those who are doing the depiction. Okay? So how do these works complicate these two discourses? Okay. They show scenes, objects, activities that invoke, that subvert, and that play with these discourses. And I use the term refract to kind of encapsulate all those ideas. Okay, so the first photo I want to draw your attention to, I thought maybe I'll center my discussion of these two issues around these two photographs. So the first photo I want to draw your attention to is this wonderful photograph by Nasrin Rahimieh, and it's from her Women of Allah series. Okay, so what do we see? Any thoughts? Okay, so we see a hand that's partially covering a mouth that is slightly open. So it's suggestive of restrictions in expression. Okay? And the writing that is displayed on her hand also kind of has an association with the Quran, or the divine revelation, the holy book of Muslims. Right? And in many accounts of Middle Eastern women historically and in the contemporary period, they often focus on Islam to explain the position and situation of women. Right? And in so doing, they ignore a multitude of other factors that are as important, if not more important, and that are also related to the practice of Islam in the region, right? And so it's important to remember that not all, and so what I want to do now is just briefly talk about what these other factors are, right? In focusing solely on Islam as a way of explaining women's positions or situations in the Middle East, what it ignores is that there are many people of the Middle East who are not Muslim, right? So it ignores other religious groups throughout the region, including Christians, Jews, so on and so forth. The other thing that it elides is that it's not just religion, but also economic relations, political systems, structures, nationalism, state power, that also play an extraordinarily important role with respect to women's position and situation in the region. And if you haven't had a chance yet to read it, I would definitely recommend a wonderful book by Laila Abulughod, an anthropologist who's based at Columbia, who recently published a book called Do Muslim Women Need Saving, that goes into this issue, right? That talks about why there's this incredible focus on explaining Middle Eastern women's positions and situations solely in terms of Islam, and what that focus elides and ignores, right? So it's a wonderful book that discusses this issue. So there are these factors these other factors that this sort of framing ignores. What it also does, or what's also important to recognize, is that what we understand as religion or culture and tradition in the Middle East are not static. Right? So these explanatory variables, these factors, are often presented as static, right, as something that has persisted over time in the same form. And it's important to remember and to also recognize that many parts of the Middle East, up until the 1970s, were under various forms of imperial and colonial control, right? And the forms that these took were myriad. It includes colonial control of, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, by France, England, so on and so forth. And under colonial systems, right, women in the household often figured in a particularly important way, right? They were often deemed to be important sites of reform and the transformation of society to make them more modern, more civilized, and so on and so forth. And so why did the colonial powers focus on the households and women in particular? One explanation that many scholars point to is that women play a key role in educating and socializing the young, right, the next generation, and that households are important spaces in terms of producing and reproducing citizens and workers. Right? And so the household was a focus of reform and transformation, of enlightenment, so-called enlightenment. And the idea was that if you focused on getting rid of superstition, backward practices in the household, right, broader transformations can happen, not just within the household, but more broadly throughout society. Right? So this discourse of households and linked to that women as sites of reform and transformation continues with anti-imperial and anti-colonial movements, that women are seen as sites of reform and transformation. Okay? But at the same time, under many anti-imperial and anti-colonial movements and nationalist movements that emerge, women are also depicted as symbols of authenticity, culture, and tradition. So in articulating anti-colonial positions in their own march to freedom from external powers, many in the Middle East depicted women and gender relations as the bastion, right, as the source, the site, the kind of protective site of authenticity, culture, tradition, symbols of the nation, so on and so forth. And so we see congealing this kind of discourse where women are associated with the household, which is associated with culture, with tradition, and these are often depicted as static and fixed, despite the fact that there have been radical, in many cases, radical transformations that have been brought about through processes of colonial modernity. So we see all these sort of conflicting dynamics and processes at play. And so we see these ideas, right, of how culture, tradition, as static, as emblematic of authenticity, identity, and culture, but also how they're played with, they're reworked, they also have been transformed through these processes. We see this, I think, at play in this photograph. So one way of reading it, right, is that, so I mentioned earlier, one way of reading it, right, is it sort of suggests or hints at a restriction in terms of expression, right? That there's a hand that's partially covering a mouth, perhaps silencing the mouth, right? Another way that it can be read is the calligraphy that we see on the hand, right? That over the hand of the person who is purportedly being silenced is actually doing the speaking for the subject here. So the voice of the woman in this case is being evoked through words that are depicted on the calligraphy on her hand. So she's speaking through the calligraphy, right? And so it invokes calligraphy as an artistic form associated with the region, associated with tradition, with culture of the region, as being a form, a vehicle of expression, right? So it's one reading, right, as opposed to just the restriction on the speaking. It's a form and a means and an expression. Another way of reading this work is to think of the calligraphy in terms of henna, right? That it's similar to traditions of henna, although it's on the back of the hand, that to my knowledge, usually the henna is on the face of the hand, but it sort of invokes the idea, or it invokes the idea of henna, which again is a practice that is traditional to the region or is associated with the region or we see in the region. And it's reminiscent of henna nights, right? Before big religious celebrations or wedding, women often gather to beautify themselves, and one of the things they do while telling stories, right, evoked by this exhibition's title of She Who Tells Stories, right, is while doing that is they do the henna as well. And so we see here, again, a form of tradition being invoked as a means of expression of women that are otherwise seen as being oppressed or whose mode of expression is otherwise restricted. And we see that these modes of expression are linked to practices that we associate with tradition and with culture, right? So rather than dominant discourses often depict culture or tradition as static and as restrictive of women's expressions. Here in the form of calligraphy and henna, we see it as possibly as a means and a vehicle of expression, so not restricting but enabling. So that's one way of reading this this thing, right? How it's playing with the idea of tradition, culture, so on and so forth. Another layer is this, we learn, as we sort of learn more about the photograph and the artist who took the artist involved, Nesrin Rahimieh, is that she is an artist who returned to Iran and sought to understand why women were participating in the Islamic Revolution. In the wake of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, or the revolutions in Iran that led to the emergence of an Islamic State, many were confused as to why women are participating in these movements, right? The idea was these movements are necessarily or intrinsically repressive of women, or oppressive of women. And Shireen, in undertaking this work, did this with the same assumption, right? But learned that this women's participation in these movements represented a form of activism, a form of agency that, an alternative form that's often not recognized, right? So women are able to articulate, engage politically through Islam, right? As opposed to Islam being a restrictive of that, but rather it's enabling, and it constitutes another form thereof. So here again, we see another layer, right, of how this photograph is playing with the idea of tradition as being static or repressive. We see here that tradition in the form of religion is being taken up, right? It's a source of empowerment or subversion or agency, an alternative form of agency that's often not recognized or represented. Okay. So I'll stop there with this photograph and move to the next dominant discourse. If we can just hit the second dominant discourse that many of these photographs refract, right? That they invoke, they rework, they subvert, and they play with. And the second dominant discourse is that of colonial or Orientalist discourses. So a predominant tradition of Western discourse about the Middle East is Orientalism. And who here has heard of Orientalism? Okay, a couple, right? So I'll just briefly go over some of the major points of Orientalism, right? One of the important underlying ideas with Orientalism is its depictions of the East by the West that do not simply reflect, but also shape how we see the East, right? So it's not simply a transparent kind of representation, but it's a process and a means through which that reality and our assumptions about that space are produced. And it's also predicated on the idea that the East and West are radically different, right? And this difference isn't innocent. The difference also implies hierarchy, or what some refer to as othering, right? And also that this difference implies conflict. And we see this in two discourses, I think, that are somewhat similar, that are more contemporary, the discourse of the Clash of Civilizations by Samuel Huntington, the idea that the world is divided into these discrete civilizations that are antithetical and sometimes conflictual towards one another, and two of the civilizational entities that he points to, the East and Islam, the West and Islam, he sees as necessarily antithetical to them. Another idea that was presented in the 1990s was the idea of mixed jihad, right? That with processes of globalization, the West or capitalism is penetrating into parts of the world that are resisting that penetration, consumerism, values associated with the West, so on and so forth, in the form of jihad. And what I'd like to suggest, just very briefly, as I'm running out of time, is that these ideas, right, that mark the continuation of Orientalist discourses that depict the East and West as radically different from one another, as antithetical, often conflictual towards one another, that it elides long histories of interrelation between the East and West. And these interrelations don't necessarily imply that the East and West so-called East and West have been in harmonious relationships with one another, can be conflictual, but that they have been interrelated. And that these differences between East and West don't necessarily precede, right? They don't precede, but they're also produced through interrelations. And I think Lala Essaydi's work, the first one, is a good example of that. If we look at the history of photography in the Middle East, we learn that it was first introduced by Westerners, right, during the colonial period, and that the photographers in these photographs often sought to depict an authentic Middle East, right, of traditional practices, so on and so forth. And we learned that many of these, what are assumed to be traditional practices that characterize the East, are actually Western fantasies and projections of the East. Okay? And here they're drawing on long traditions of representation of the East as being a place of sensuousness, of sumptuous wealth, of lax and lascivious morals. And we see this often in the form. There's a long trajectory of Western representations of recombinant and languorous odalisques, right? This is part and parcel of the eroticization, the exoticization of the East. And we see this invoked in the first photograph. And one other element of these photographs that are emerging in the colonial period, and we see Lala Seydi playing with here, is they were often staged. Right? These photographs taken by photographers were often in studios. They used women from the region. They hired women, paid women from the region to be part of these, to have their photos taken. And often many of these women were engaged in the sex work industry, or they were marginalized Western women who were part of colonial systems. Because many of the women in the region, they refused to allow their pictures to be taken. And so in the studios, the artists, the photographers, often reconstructed their own ideas of the harem and, in other cases, of hammam spaces, right, that Westerners were otherwise not allowed into but had great interest in. And so we see here, right, these Orientalist depictions that literally construct another in particular ways, right, exoticized, eroticized, so on and so forth, where differences are produced. They're assumed and produced through the representations, right? And here, these differences are not innocent, right? They imply hierarchy or superiority, so lax, lascivious morals versus upright Westerners, laziness versus hard work, so on and so forth. So these differences are also mapped onto evaluations of East and West. And again, and just the last point I'll say is that many of these depictions, they systematically exclude and excise the influence and the impact of colonialism in West and the East, right? So not only do we not see the person who's actually constructing the images that we see, right? But we also do not see how the very systems that they are a part of have been reshaping, that seamlessly timeless or static tradition that they seek to depict. And in the case of Lala Seydi's work, if any of you get a chance, please look closely at these sort of the textured surfaces we see on the woman's body and around her. We see that those textured surfaces, has anyone seen them? Who knows what they are? Okay, can someone tell me? They're bullets, right? So it invokes kind of violence, the emergence of arms in the region that are all linked to, again, colonial processes of colonial modernity in the presence of colonialism, the sort of dynamics that entails. And so here she's invoking violence, technologies, relations that otherwise get excised from these images, right? Yet also reproducing the very idea of the Orientalist odalist, right? So again, invoking, subverting, and playing with many of these dominant tropes and discourses. And then finally, Khadirian's work, it's a series, or it's not perhaps the clearest or the biggest, not enlarged enough, but the photographs at the bottom also invoke this idea, right? These everyday images that render ordinary, right? Otherwise fantastical and exoticized bodies and places, right? So Middle Eastern women, the Middle East, by bringing in everyday objects like newspapers, radios, so on and so forth. So the very items that are part and parcel of the transformation of the region that often get excised or ignored in dominant representations of it. So these are just a few readings. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you to everyone who's made this possible today. I'll focus my comments on Persian literature and on the role of women in Persian poetry in particular, and after saying some preliminary remarks, I'll focus really on what was happening at the very beginning of the 20th century up until maybe the 1920s, 1930s. And then I'll give you some examples of, seeing as this is about women speaking, and I'm not a woman, I'll give you some examples of my translations of women's poetry from that period to see how these people, as Attiya said, although I think my reading of them might be a little different, but these women who are so often othered, and I would argue women in the 19-teens, 1920s, 1930s in the Middle East are kind of doubly and triply othered, because they're also othered by their own societies, how they spoke and what they had to say about being women in the society and about the position of women and the oppression that they felt in a patriarchal society. The subtitle of this exhibition, which is wonderful, is an Arabic word, rawiya, which in Persian we have as ravi or raviyeh. Rawiya, means or can be used nowadays to mean a narrator, and the tamarbuta on the end makes it feminine, so a female narrator. A rawi in origin is the person that recites someone else's poetry at a gathering. So not the person who's produced the poem, but the person who recites it for others. And that was a profession that people had. We could have made the subtitle of sha'ara, sha'ara, a female poet, which is a category in its own right and not a pejorative term. But really what I would like to focus on is the idea of natiqa, of the female who speaks. And women have been speaking, and this goes even further back in Arabic, in recorded literary history. Women have been speaking in New Persian for at least a millennium of recorded history. One of the earliest women that those of you who know Persian poetry will be familiar with is Rabi'a Balkhi, who is from what is now northern Afghanistan. In a later period, so she's 10th century most likely, in a later period, probably the early 12th century, we have Mahsati Ganjavi, who was active in the Seljuk period. These two women poets represent a chaste and a not so chaste, a chaste and a bawdy interpretation of what it meant to do poetry as women in the early medieval period. And as I said, women were speaking through poetry from the early days of Rabi'a and Mahsati all the way up to the 19th century. There is a continuum, there is a tradition of women's writing and speaking. Of course, with the advent of what we normally call modernity and the coming of more influence and contact and not direct colonization of what is now Iran, but a relationship and very often an imbalanced relationship with the West, certain things happen in poetry and happen in literature that change the way in which literature is done. And that's what really I want to talk about now. In 1901, the Divan of Gohar Khanum, Shamsat al-Shu'ara, a granddaughter of the second Qajar, King Fath Ali Shah, was printed in Esfahan. Running to over 400 pages and containing more than 8,000 lines of poetry, many of which are in praise of female patrons, this divan is most likely the first to have been published by any woman poet in modern Iran. Although Gohar Khanum's divan in terms of style and content looks back to the 19th century and builds upon the elite female poetic tradition we know to have existed in early and mid-Qajar Iran, it is significant in that it demonstrates how, by the dawn of the 20th century, Iranian women poets were beginning to carve a niche for themselves in an hitherto male-dominated literary sphere. With the explosion in the late 19th and early 20th century in printing, the publication of newspapers and periodicals, the establishment of numerous women's societies, and the appearance of new literary and later women-focused journals, women poets and writers were presented with new outlets through which to disseminate their work widely. Through these various avenues, poetry penned by women began to reach a much larger reading public than ever before. The female poets of the early 20th century in Iran were, as Farzaneh Milani has written, taking off their veils and struggling for what they perceived to be freedom. Their poetry, as she has said, was used as a forum by them for demands for equal rights by a wide spectrum of women. Just as significant is the manner in which, through their poetry, an ever-growing number of women poets in this period strove to establish, and in some cases succeeded in establishing, their literary credentials alongside those of their male peers. For the most part, and I'll give you 3 examples of poetry from women of this period, it could be argued that women contributed, and certain women more than others, of course, but women contributed to making Persian poetry truly modern in the early 20th century. They made it expressive of their here and now. As women, they displayed, as Milani has said, unusual courage in articulating women's experience from women's perspectives. The majority of them were devoted to discussing and challenging forces that they felt victimized them. Women poets, of course, encountered the added obstacle of being faced with a society that on the whole considered them inferior, both in terms of their gender and in terms of their literary credentials. Women poets who displayed considerable skill were dubbed freakish anomalies and often accused of being overly manly. They suffered for the right to express themselves in their verse and to be taken seriously by men. But like their male contemporaries, Iranian women poets in the first decades of the 20th century gradually broke away from traditional modes of expression and cliched amorous or didactic themes and concerned themselves, some more overtly than others, with the status of women in Iranian society, the plight of the poor and the underprivileged, and the future of their nation. These women were the poetic forerunners of the female literary giants of the mid to late 20th century, Simin Behbahani, who unfortunately died last year, and Furugh Farrokhzad. So to give you a couple of examples from the poetry of the mother of Simin Behbahani, Fakhr Ozma Arghun, who is known in her poetry as Fakhri, who was born in 1899 and died in 1966. She was a very impressive woman in terms of her activity in a feminist, prominent feminist or proto-feminist women's society, but also as an editor, as a translator from French, as a teacher of French in high schools in Iran, and as someone who really, if we look at Simin Behbahani and her career, someone who very much encouraged her daughter to write and encouraged her daughter to publish her poetry. In one of her poems, which is a typical, what we can call in Persian, a ghazal vatani, so a ghazal which is normally considered to be love poetry, but which became used in the early 20th century very commonly for nationalistic and patriotic purposes. And she used it to talk about what she felt needed to be done in the Iran of the 1920s and 30s. The country must be stained tulip red with the blood of traitors. From every corner of the land must flow rivers of blood. If you wish to have the glory and majesty of the Kayanids like Kaveh, Jamshid's country must be cleansed of all debased Zahaks. She turns in that poem to talk about corrupt people in the newly established parliament. Every deputy who got elected through coercion and gold should be expelled from the consultative assembly. Every building that was erected through cruelty and injustice must be destroyed altogether and toppled to the ground. These are women coming out of their imagined, at least, domestic spaces. She, like many others, resorts to the Shahnameh, to the great epic of the Persian king and hero stories, completed in 1010. And she uses that mythology and that history and that legend to talk about what she feels needs to happen in terms of reform. She plays very skillfully with the poetic canon. And here, in another poem, she addresses men. And as Attiya said about women's bodies and women's persons being seen as sites for modernization, this is a reaction here to this idea of, well, education for girls is important because girls will educate the next generation, but why do you still consider me inferior to you? O Zephyr, ask this question on my behalf from men. Why am I called weak in this country? If I am weak, why then am I charged with the job of raising a man to rival Rostam? O woman, clothe yourself with the robe of knowledge. Happy the day when you will wear such a garment. For Fakhri, knowledge is so sweet, Shirin, that she strives continually for it, just like Farhad. She was a very patriotic poet. You can hear a lot of her echoes of her patriotism, her chauvinism almost, in the poetry, the nationalistic poetry of Simin Behbahani, her daughter. Zandokh Shirazi, who was born in 1909, died in 1952, was really a very strident, a very bold, and a young woman who suffered greatly for her ideal of not only promoting a particular way of being a woman in Iran in the first half of the 20th century, but also trying to promote the publication of women-centered journals. She also wrote a lot of Ghazal Vatani, and she talked again a lot about the position of women in society and attacked mandatory veiling. I know not what this shroud, mask, and face veil are. If we are human beings, then what's all this torment? O Zephyr, ask our royal king what the beauty is in being elected without the participation of women. Why do the leading men of our country remain silent? For a wakeful nation, what's all this slumber? If indeed you are occupied solely with thoughts of patriotism, then what's all this revelry and drinking? Some of these early women poets of the early 20th century, I think, not that they write in a manly way, but they adopt sometimes, and that's partly what Attiya was alluding to, they sometimes adopt the discourse, the dominant discourse of modernity, modernization, to such an extent that they themselves, when they address women, sound misogynistic. For what reason, says Zandokh, is commerce not women's work? By what logic is industrial work not fit for me? Why shouldn't women themselves make women's shoes? Why aren't women surgeons and physicians? So, my sisters, how long will you remain idle? Are you created only for breeding? Are you only skilled in loving men? A last poet, a third poet, Alamtaj Qaim Maqami, who's known as Jaleh, is a slightly different poet in terms of her family background. She's related to the very impressive and rather tragic figure, Qaim Maqam Farahani, the prime minister in the middle of the 19th century. She was born in 1883 and died in 1946. She was, unlike Fakhri and Zandokh, she was opposed to publishing her poetry. I think partly because she saw herself as a private person, and she used her poetry to talk about her failed, rather disastrous marriage and her difficult relationship with her parents. But her poetry, especially when read alongside the poetry of Parveen Ehtesami, who is a very published poet of the same period, is very interesting in that Jaleh often goes a little bit of a step further than Parveen, perhaps because she didn't intend her poetry to be published. It was collected after her death and published by her son, who himself was a man of letters and a poet. Jaleh talks about some very more awkward things in her society that she was not very happy about. One is honor killing. If a man loses his mind out of love for a woman, it is permissible because he is a man, and what he does is not to be questioned. But if even the slightest desire finds its way into a woman's mind, even if religious law does not allow her killing, common law does. It falls to her brother, her father, or her husband to stone her, for the love of a girl or a woman for a stranger is a sin. She herself was married as a fairly young girl to a man that she, in her poetry at least, seems to have despised. And she talks about, maybe not an uncommon thing at the time, but she talks about this in her poetry, and also goes a step further to talk about child marriage in general. He who buys a woman by force and with gold against her will is in reality a stranger to her, even if outwardly he is her husband. Although it appears to be our consent that facilitates what happens. The lips that say yes are those of our mothers' mouths. If in our religion the girl must be 9 years old to marry, physical and mental maturity are two other preconditions. Elsewhere, if a 9-year-old girl reaches puberty, dear sister, there's no place for such a trade as exists in our country. How does a 9-year-old girl know what a husband is? Since when does a wedding dress suit one who plays with dolls? Jaleh was also, like many of the female poets, and many of the male poets, indeed, of this period, a staunch supporter of unveiling, and wrote very often in her poetry about how she felt trapped not only in the veil, but also in the secluded space of the interior of her house. I am a most proud person, but convicted of womanhood, in the family of humankind, you could say I was nobody. In the cemetery of the harem, with tar-colored shroud, I've been tossed like rubbish on the sewage of existence. On the other side of my prison is a city and much tumult. Alas, I am in the city, but the city lies beyond my reach. I think that last quote is very interesting in relation to the photographs, many of the photographs in the exhibition, both from Iran and from the broader Middle East, because a lot of them do talk about domestic space, and they do, as Attiya said, kind of challenge our view, I think, to a certain extent at least, and challenge some of those dominant interpretations of women's lives in the contemporary Middle East. There is a wish here on the part of Jaleh to be involved in public life, to be involved beyond that confining space. And I think we see that expressed in a lot of the photos here. So I'll leave it at that, and maybe later we'll have some questions. Thank you.
Let me, before turning the mic over to our last speaker, make a brief announcement. Professor Brookshaw will be giving another talk tomorrow at 1 o'clock, titled Seeing Them How They Intended to Be Seen, Portraits of Women Writers from Qajar, Iran. It will be in Encino Hall Central, the Philippines room. The Abbasi program is the sponsor. So if you like what you hear, there's plenty more where that came from tomorrow.
Also, if you don't like what you hear.
Well, thank you very much. I, too, would like to begin by thanking all the organizers and sponsors. And I'm delighted to be among such eminent scholars and colleagues and friends, and to renew bonds with Dominic, a collaborator for many years, and Abbas Milani, the eminent scholar of Iranian studies. I also want to make note of the fact that I have this amazing occasion to renew bonds with a second cousin, Sadiq Barirani, an eminent graphic artist from Iran, and his daughter Pupak, who are here. Thank you for coming. If I may begin by just, again, like you, Attiya, I am not, since I'm not in the domain of the visual arts, and I have no formal training, I won't really talk about the photos. I will talk about Persian poetry, prose. I was so taken with poetry. But may I just make one note about Attiya, the figure that the hand that you talked about, that particular image. What's really complicated about that is that the words written on the fingers are actually poetry by an eminent Iranian modern poet, Forough Farrokhzad, one of her well-known poems. So it is tradition, but it also brings the new poetic voices into. So with that, if I may talk about ordinary lives. I'd like to speak about patterns that we have witnessed, not just me, but other critics have witnessed in Iranian women's writing over the past 3.5 decades. it's no coincidence that the time frame I've just indicated is delineated by the 1979 revolution. It would not be accurate to claim that the revolution was responsible for the burgeoning of women's writing, though perhaps it would not be far-fetched to say that the restrictions applied to women's participation in or appearance in public life paradoxically fueled other modes of cultural presence and expression. Interestingly, the focus of the writing that emerged in the wake of the revolution is turned inward. There's a great deal of variety, both in the genres and the themes employed by women writers. Not surprisingly, one of the striking aspects of contemporary women's writing is the representation of domesticity and how women occupy and or are socially and culturally conditioned to configure themselves in the space of the home. This is really, in and of itself, not unprecedented in the domain of modern Persian literature. What is different in the new writing by women is the way the domestic space itself is represented. Before I turn to a couple of examples, and like Dominic, I will just cite a few passages here and there, I'd like to move back in time a little bit and give a sense of how domesticity was reflected in one particular woman's writing in the decades, many decades before the revolution. Well, not that many. There's no, in my view, for such a short presentation, there's no better example to turn to than Simin Daneshvar's celebrated novel, Savashun, which was published in 1969 and became one of the most popular novels in Persian. The protagonist in that novel, Zari, is depicted as an educated and headstrong woman who, after her marriage, becomes devoted to her husband and children and also social work in the community. The novel itself is set during the Second World War, and more specifically when the southern part of the country is occupied by the British forces. The political turmoil of the time inevitably seeps into the family's domestic life. While Zari's husband is engaged on the political scene, Zari adheres to her apparently domestic responsibilities. I'd like to just quote a passage in the novel, from the novel, in which Zari enters a room where her husband and his friends are meeting in secret to organize armed resistance against the British occupying forces and as their Iranian collaborators. Now, this is a quote from the novel. She entered the room and placed the hookah in front of her husband. The air in the parlor was hot and stifling with all the doors shut, and she could see the sweat beads on the men's foreheads. She went to the cupboard and took out some fans, which she placed on the table in the middle of the room. Then she took out some side plates and knives and forks and set them noiselessly on the table. Strangely enough, the 2 watermelons which Zari had just cut open were both yellow and unripe. She took this as a bad omen. The 3rd watermelon wasn't too bad, and she was about to cut each slice in a zigzag pattern when she decided that her guests were too preoccupied to notice. She placed the dish of watermelon slices next to the map of Iran, which they had spread out on the table. They were all bending over it now. End of quote. This part of the novel ends with Zari being asked by her husband, although very indirectly and politely, to leave the room. Even when outside forces intrude into her sphere and she is called upon to extend hospitality to the guests, she remains a hostess and a caretaker, hovering at the edges of the discussion about the nation's future. As the men pore over the map of Iran, Zari considers cutting the watermelon into decorative pieces. the juxtaposition of the metaphoric carving out of the nation by foreign and native forces, and Zari's limited reach to carving up food and nourishment for the men who are defending the nation, delineates women's role in the project of the formation of the modern nation. When her husband is killed at the end of the novel, Zari musters up the courage to face the hostile forces beyond her home, but the novel ends with mourning and burial. Turning now to more contemporary short stories and novels, we also find women in the domestic sphere and caught up in the demands of home and family. One of the better-known contemporary writers, Iranian writers, is Zoya Pirzad, an Armenian-Iranian writer, some of whose works have already been published, translated into English. Pirzad's protagonists also appear to be mired in the daily routines. Her first novel is called I Will Turn Off the Lights, Man چراغا را من خاموش میکنم, translated into English as Things We Have Left Unsaid. The Persian title captures the routine nature of the life depicted in the novel. The phrase refers to the answers the wife protagonist gives her husband every night when he's off to bed and he asks if she will turn off the lights, and she replies, yes, I will turn off the lights. If the repeated phrase becomes emblematic of her life, the novel also takes us into an interior world in which the phrase becomes a nightly reminder of all that is missing in her life. Now, Pirzad, staying with the same writer, next novel, We Will Get Used to It, عادت میکنیم, depicts the life of a divorced woman living with her mother and teenage daughter. This novel, too, builds on a seemingly ordinary life. But unlike the heroine of Daneshvar, the first novel I mentioned, Daneshvar's novel, Pirzad's protagonists exhibit no sense of contentment with their lot in life, nor do they see themselves as extensions of their husbands and families. Instead, they take us into the complexities of these ordinary subjects, seemingly engaged in endless repetition of routines. They show us inner ruptures that cannot be neatly mapped onto the national struggle. To borrow words from the French critic Michel de Certeau, they put on display the practices of everyday life to reveal strains and inner ruptures that disrupt social expectations and structures of power. I'm just going to end. How am I doing for time?
You're doing very well.
Okay. I'd like to draw to one more collection, and then I'll stop at the end of this, of interconnected short stories, also by Pirzad, entitled The Acrid Taste of Persimmons, Tame Gase Khormalu, to illustrate this particular point. In one of the stories, the central character is a woman named Mahnaz who has decided to already leave her husband. As Mahnaz sits at the kitchen reminiscing about their life together, she recalls one particular dinner party she and her husband Faramaz gave. The guest list was made up by him and was made up of his superiors, and the dinner party was intended to represent him as its best. Now, what's important to keep in mind is that both she and her husband are professionals, they work. But for this dinner party, she has worked very hard to make it appear as exactly as he would want it. I quote from a passage from that. When the guests arrived and were seated, Faramaz, the husband, motioned toward the kitchen. Bless you. And Mahnaz served tea. Then Faramaz glanced in the direction of the nut dish, and Mahnaz served the guests pistachios and almonds. Then she brought out the hors d'oeuvres. Suddenly forgot my French. I can only speak one language at a time. For a second time, she served tea to everyone, with the exception of the managing director's wife, who drank only hot water. Faramaz glanced at the dining table, and Mahnaz cleared away the dishes. She did not remove the nut dish because the managing director's wife had exclaimed, "What delicious pistachios!" And Faramaz had gestured to Mahnaz not to take the dish away. In her trips back and forth between the kitchen and the parlor, she heard the men talking about work at the company. The women listened in silence. Mahnaz was just wondering why the women weren't talking when Faramaz said, "Mahnaz, dear, why are you going back and forth so much? The ladies are bored. Come and sit down and chat with them." End of quote. The pace of the evening and the execution of the husband's orders encapsulate Mahnaz's married life. The event goes almost completely according to plan until Mahnaz ventures to an opinion about what's being discussed among the men about the work of the company. After the guests have left, her husband turns to her and says, "My darling, you were a great hostess this evening, except your beans were a little too hard. And I think you added too much garlic to the chicken. I'm just saying that for your sake and for the next time. And by the way, speaking of the next time, please don't speak of the company's business to my boss. He doesn't like women interfering in work." End of quote. With this assertion, Faramaz introduces a clear demarcation between men and women's work. This division of labor, masterfully performed and celebrated in Danishvar's novel, rings hollow in this story. Not only is Mahnaz's work not confined to the realm of the apartment, she's also subject to Faramaz's assertion of authority on what could be considered women's domestic concerns. The passage I've just quoted about the dinner party demonstrates his obsessive concern about how food must be served, as do most of his exchanges with Mahnaz about all manner of household-related chores, from how to dust the furniture, how to make tea, and when to wash the curtains. This is not so much a role reversal as a sign of gender crisis. As his perceived field of power is impinged upon by his wife, Faramaz is increasingly drawn to incursions into what he believes to be his wife's proper domain of labor and authority. But the trouble with this mode of extending his power is that it does not have the desired effect on the wife. She does not recognize the boundaries that are so fundamental to Faramaz's self-actualization and acts on her instincts against his injunctions. Let me conclude then by just making a few leaps and bounds, because I'm not going to offer more examples, but we see a certain instability of the prescribed or traditional gender roles in the works that I examine. And what I would like to conclude with is just what my own interpretation of what this might indicate. This overview of what has emerged in Iranian women's literature in the wake of the revolution highlights representations of fissures and ruptures in familial and domestic settings. Gender inequalities and what I've called gender crisis are certainly part and parcel of the shifts and breaks depicted in these novels and short stories. But they fit into a broader and more complex interrogation of gender, individual, communal, and ultimately, I would say, national identity. Mothers, wives, fathers, children, husbands come under question or query their sense of self. The literature, the Iranian literature of the contemporary era, 30-some years after the revolution, after a revolution whose objective was to rid the nation of its ailments, paints a different picture of what ails the nation. The array of characters and the complexities of the lives they represent attest to a departure from a myth of a nation united against exploitation by external forces or imperial forces. In the narratives of seemingly ordinary characters, these stories shine a light on the neglected interior spaces of the nation and invite us to look deeper into its core. Thank you.
Before we open it to your questions, I want to make a couple of connecting comments to some of the characters who were discussed here, who have been here at Stanford before, and you can go on websites and see them here. Simine Behbahani has been here 3 times. She has won an award that we gave. She was here twice, gave talks. And then last year when she passed, we had a program in memory of her where there are some very interesting discussions about her. So if you want to see Simine Behbahani, she's really a remarkable character. There are plenty of images, plenty of discussions, plenty of her talks. Simine Daneshvar, from whom she read, was a fellow at Stanford University. She did a fellowship at Stanford. She was affiliated, although she was not a Stegner fellow, but she was affiliated with the Stegner Center, and she was a very good student of Stegner himself. When my sister Farzaneh Milani compiled an edition of a journal in memory of Simine Daneshvar, one of the most remarkable essays was written by Stegner in memory of Simine Daneshvar. Finally, we have had Shirin in a shot here as well. We showed her film, A Woman Without Men, and we are probably going to try to see if we can have her back here. Finally, in the discussion about Simine Behbahani, one of the presenters was Farzaneh Milani. She has translated Simine Behbahani into English. And she said something I think that connects all of these discussions. She said, the unheralded third revolution in modern Iranian history is a revolution by women. He says everyone talks about the constitutional revolution of 1905, everyone talks about the 1979 revolution, but maybe the more important revolution nobody talks about is the emergence of women from the interior of the house to the public domain. 64% of college graduates in Iran today are women. That is a remarkable fact. Women are creating a remarkable new reality. These pictures are the tip of the iceberg. I think women are at the forefront of the democratic struggle in Iran, and they are creating a new political landscape, a new cultural landscape, a new literary landscape. And what these wonderful presentations have given us, I think, is different facets of a profound revolution that is happening. Don't be fooled by the images of septuagenarian men ruling Iran. There's something else happening, and the Faramarzes of the world have a big surprise coming for them very soon. So,
Thank you. May I just say that the connecting link between all of us, I'm so glad you mentioned Farzaneh, your sister, who is a great mentor and colleague of ours as well.
the floor is yours. Yes, ma'am.
I would like to know more about some of these people you've talked about today, but I have no idea how to spell them, where I can find these names if I can't spell.
That's a good idea. How do you spell their names?
Yes. I don't even have a pen to write it down. I mean,
Do you, some of the Dominiques, are they translated, Dominique, or you have translated them?
I can write them down for you afterwards.
Yeah.
And because he has an English accent, it comes out more clear.
I'll write some down for you then.
The statistic of the college enrollment is very interesting. 64% are women. I observed the same stats in Qatar and other Arabian countries as well, where people say, well, the men went abroad. They went abroad to study, or they were doing other businesses and other. So what are the men doing? Why are they not going to college?
Oh, I think they are going to college. It's just that
It's competitive to go to college.
it's competitive, and there's an entrance examination. So there's been some alarm lately about the fact that women have overtaken, as it were, in the national examinations. So that there's been some rumblings about a quota. But men are going to school. They are. Many of them are doing well. I'm sure Stanford, like my university, has a lot of Iranian male engineers coming to study here too. But it's not that they are absent. I think what I was talking about, and what Farzaneh and others have noted as well, is that there's a way in which you cannot just return to what was status quo. Even before the revolution, some of the moments of the most modern, open society that we had. So it's an attitudinal change. And as Abbas pointed out, we saw the important role the women played in the wake of the 2009 elections. And we also have seen them in the very deliberate, constantly building movements for women's rights, for women's equality, a 1 million signature campaign. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Are women involved in international politics at all? Do women have any power or clout in the international discourse?
This is more Abbas's domain.
I think Attiya wants to answer.
So women in Iran or in the Middle East? Okay, well, I think you could speak to
Ostensibly, politics is completely dominated by men, but if by politics you mean something larger than what is at stake in the...
Like those who would wage war on Iran?
Well, wars is waged by men. That's generally the pattern of male history. That's why I'm counting the days when women can become dominant. Maybe we can go into a less violent world. No, I mean that. I'm not being facetious. But if by politics you mean the overt conduct of diplomacy, it is male-dominated. Women are virtually excluded. But if by politics you mean cultural exchange, if you mean educational exchange, if you mean shaping the image of Iran in the international community, women have a very, very prominent place to play. Again, the first woman in history to win the Fields Prize in mathematics is an Iranian woman who happens to be at Stanford. I don't want to keep bringing back to Stanford. We are at Stanford, but look at the films. Look at the domain of Silicon Valley, the number of Iranian entrepreneurial, successful women in this area. One of the biggest philanthropist donors to Stanford is an Iranian woman, Bita Daryabari, who's creating a foundation to help Iranian exiles. So these are political issues, but they're not politics as we traditionally understand it.
Right, and I would just add to that, the example of Pakistan, right, where Benazir Bhutto was the prime minister, the leader, that official participation or, leadership positions don't necessarily index women's general position in society or in politics in general, right? So there are other forms of power and power relations and power systems, et cetera, that we need to account for, but also not assume that women being in positions of power necessarily mean that the gendered asymmetries and gendered systems have been changed, right, in ways that we deem progressive.
I might add that Iran has a female vice president, Masumeh Ibtekar, who's in charge of the Environmental Protection Agency, and she's very capable of kicking men out.
There's a question at the back.
There's one in the back.
Oh.
Right at the back.
So this would be for Professor Rahimieh or Brookshaw. The common theme of women's plight in the writing, whether it's prose or poetry. This sort of issue, if it dominates their writing, is the impression that I got certainly indicates. What kind of audience are they really addressing, and in fact, are they were they effective in reaching their intended target audience? Because it would be preaching to the choir, right, for the women, for them to relate to, if those were the primary topics. And then at the same time, if men were not interested in those writings, then they're not really. The vehicle of the prose and poetry may not be as effective as one would hope. In contrast to poetry of men, which might be about love, it might be about mystical topics, storytelling, longing, whatever it may be. I'm trying to understand, really, from your perspective in your studies, and certainly youth, if you have a perspective on this too, but really, how effective has this vehicle been?
Well, I think I'm going to just address it briefly, but because I think Dominic should address the earlier, because we're talking about two different moments in history, and the whole.
I'm interested in both of them.
Okay, great. So let me say my part is that if you go to Tehran, and there are, first of all, the whole scene of publishing and reading has changed. To our own surprise, because there's much larger literacy rate than we had before the revolution. So the reading public is huge. Mm-hmm. And they do devour and read at a different pace than we do here. I must say that I'm sometimes embarrassed that my own students in classes don't read as much as Iranian readers, read just casually. But I will say this, that Zoya Pirzad won one of the literary prizes in Iran. Mm-hmm. So it is the Islamic Republic's own institutions that are giving these prizes out. So the message is getting out, I would say, today. But that is a different scene from what Dominique described.
It's always difficult to know, I think, even in this contemporary period, who is reading what and how they understand what they read, and I defy anyone to be able to define that in any culture or reading public. But these women that I talked about, they wrote about all manner of things. But of course, the plight of women or the situation of women in the society was something that, as women, preoccupied them. And that's natural and normal. For the ones who did publish their own work, so not Jale Qaim Maqami, but the other two that I talked about, certainly, so Zandocht, not exclusively, but she did publish a lot of her own work, self-published in the journal that she had, which was primarily read by women. But she also published in a number of periodicals in Persian, published both in Iran and outside of Iran, in India and in other places. So she was quite well known at her time, for her time. The mother of Simin Behbahani, as I said, was involved in editing and publishing and periodicals and translation. And she also wrote some poetry. And so like male contemporaries, such as both of her husbands, were also men who were writers, but also editors and translators and publishers. So she was very similar, profile to the husbands that she had. And they also either wrote short stories or some of them wrote poetry. So I think by the 1920s and 30s, definitely, you have a group of women writing who are writing in many ways just like the men of the period and are publishing in very similar ways, and I think are being read by very similar groups of people. There's a lot of poetry, and this, I don't know about Urdu, but there's a lot of poetry written in Arabic and Turkish and Persian in the same period, from the 1890s up until the 1930s and 40s, which is written by men, poetry and other works, which is about veiling and about the position of women and about the emancipation of women. And so it's something that very much preoccupied male writers. So I don't think it's terribly important, the gender of the person who's being published.
Professor Brookshaw, sorry to have you monopolize this right now, but could you say a little bit more about, forgive the butchery of the pronunciation, Farouk Farrouzad,
Mhm.
because there are many people who see this photograph who don't know her work at all.
Sure.
And so the work described as a beautiful teaser, but if I could learn a little bit more from
Sure.
you about this poem.
Well, we have an edited volume that you could,
We could-
read.
Would you like to buy a copy?
Or you could buy a copy. It's quite reasonable in paperback. But in that, there's a book chapter about the impact of...
What's the name of your book? Would you?
It's called Farouk Farrokhzad, Poet of Modern Iran, and then it has a very long subtitle, which I won't tell you. But you can find it. If you do Rahimieh and Brookshaw and Farouk, you'll find it. There is a chapter about the impact of Farouk Farrokhzad on the diaspora, which is written by a colleague of ours, Persis Karim, who's at San Jose. And in that, she discusses this image at one point. And we helped her a little bit, I think, in understanding the image, because it's not only, this image is fascinating to me, because what is on the, I don't know what, on the back of the hand, so not on the fingers, is an Shi'i Islamic invocation, a very religious one, a very traditional one. Ya Qamar Bani Hashim. You know, this is something very religious. On the fingers, it's from a very famous poem of hers, which was published after her untimely death in a car accident, which is called I Feel Sorry for the Garden. It's about the destruction as she envisages it of what's going to happen to her in the 70s. And she was killed in 1967 in a car accident. But what is fascinating is not just, as Attiya pointed out, this is in a kind of henna style, and henna is obviously so important to, not maybe by this point, but in up until the early mid-20th century, there's a lot of idioms around femininity and womanhood and henna and marriage and things like that. So you've got that connection. But what also fascinates me is that this is a very bad hand in Persian. It's not a beautiful calligraphic hand, right? And what it evokes as well, and what is so interesting, and I think many people misread this as being Islamic, partly for this reason, is that the poetry is reproduced in a way that you see on folk art, and folk art that is related to kind of grassroots Shiism in Iran. So it's not a beautiful hand, it's not very good calligraphy. It looks as if it's written very quickly by someone, but quickly as you would see on a kind of talismanic object, etc., etc. There's a movement which I think is from the 60s up until the 70s, and you see it now in modern art, the movement of the Saqakhane, so a modernist movement in Iranian art, which this is inspired by in many ways, which takes traditional folk art, normally folk art related to religiosity, and reinterprets it and uses it in a modern way. And one of the most important examples of someone who now is really based in Canada and who is getting a lot of attention recently in America and with a new exhibit is Parviz Tanavoli. And he is a sculptor primarily, but he's also really a collector and a scholar of the kind of art that inspires the sculpture and the painting and this kind of art that comes after it. So what Shirin Neshat has done is really take those things, and bring them into a photograph and really play with this, many of the ideas that Attiya was talking about, play with this idea of the silent woman, or the woman that appears to be silencing herself. But then Farouk Farrokhzad is one of the best examples of a woman that couldn't be shut up in modern Iran. So there is a kind of game there, there's an irony. But presenting it in a way that, with all of all of these women, it's women of Allah, isn't it? This series is called something like that. Which is a very interesting way as well, to use Allah in that way in Persian makes a kind of statement. But, it's a fascinating image. And there's a little bit more about that in that chapter.
In one of the talks she gave, she says that the poetry of Farouk is what inspired her to move from painting to photography, because she was an unsuccessful painter, educated at UC Berkeley. And then she decided, she said in one of her lectures, that she read Farouk and was very inspired by how she can't be stopped, and then use all of these things. One more?
Have you talked to Shirin Nishad about this composition? Because she is the one who made it, and she's a phone call away. I mean, just to figure out if that coincides with your analysis. I'm just curious.
I don't have her number, but I've heard she's very approachable.
I have
I'm not
her
sure if
number.
that's important, but
Yeah.
No, I'm just, because does it coincide with what you're saying?
Actually, Shirin Nishad herself would say, I've had conversations with her, public conversations with her, and engagement with her, film as well as photographs, is that there's a level at which she wants her audience and the people who are seeing the images or the film to decide on their own. Because, of course, you and I will each bring to bear something on this, right? And she would hesitate to be very autocratic about that.
Dogmatic.
In fact, I remember the first time Shirin Nishad's work was on exhibit publicly was a conference that Farzaneh Milani organized at University of Virginia.
And both of us were there.
That's right. And I remember that many of us scholars and some of us feminists actually took her to task and say some of these images are antithetical to what you are trying to do. And she was fascinated by that. She said, it's interesting because that's not what I set out to do. So,
As Milan Kundera says, artists are never as smart as their work. So we have one last question and a very brief answer because we have to get out of this place by 6.
Well, anyway, do you have the image of Roha? Is that also Baruch Hazan's poetry on that, the Roha photograph?
No.
What is the calligraphy on that photograph?
I think it's one of the ones that you were talking
No,
about.
it's the other Shirin shot in the show.
Yeah,
It's
Roha.
from
I
the
think
shot,
it's
the Book
Roha.
of Kings
Oh,
series.
Yes,
The
yeah, it's not here.
Patriarch.
Yes, it's not here.
No, we don't.
Yeah, it's in the exhibition.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for